Kara Dansky, who I previously had a conversation with on this channel, published The Abolition of Sex in 2021. With a background in the legal world, as well as with the women's liberation front, the book stands out amongst other gender-critical and trans-critical literature for its focus on law, and a blunt writing style that aims for an audience of those who are ignorant of and uneducated about how gender ideology affects not only women, but the world at large. The first chapter, titled What is a Woman, centers around the usage of the common mantra, trans women are women. She writes, "It is commonplace today to say, and to think we have to say, that trans women are women, but little thought is given to what this assertion actually means. When feminists question its meaning, we are told that trans women are women because they say they are. Everyone in society is expected to go along with this fiction." In other words, she is writing about the lack of critical thought and the goodwill required by women in particular to support the inclusion of trans-identified men in women's spaces, and the erasure of women and law in society. I especially appreciate the lack of coddling. She blatantly calls the practice of calling men women because they claim to identify as one a lie. Other authors like Helen Joyce aim to cater to an audience that is undecided and perhaps still empathetic to gender ideology. It doesn't lessen their message or ruin their content, but often refusing to blatantly and honestly discuss the elephant in the room further perpetuates the issue. We're all aware that trans women are men and trans men are women, playing along with a request to be addressed as of the opposite sex, even as lightly as using the term trans women, plays into the validation of a falsely claimed identity. Playing along is what led to the inclusion of men in women's spaces, and I appreciate the willingness to bluntly and directly address this issue. Kara follows this passage with two conversations which reflect the ways that women often contribute to this, both of which are likely familiar with anyone who discusses these topics in real life. The first one reads, "Why are you so focused on the transgender issue?" Before answering, I would like to ask what, exactly, you mean by the transgender issue. Well, I guess I mean people who are transgender. Fair enough. Do you typically use words that you don't know the meaning of? No, I don't. I know you don't, so why are you doing that here? I guess I don't know the answer to that either. The second conversation followed a woman asking Kara, "What can we do about the issue of transgender athletes in women's sports?" To which Kara replied, "I have some advocacy ideas, but first let me ask, what do you mean by transgender athletes?" "Well, I thought we had to use this terminology." "Do you mean men and boys?" "Yes." "Okay, why don't you just say men and boys, if that's what you mean?" "I didn't think we were allowed to say that." Both of these conversations are ones which illustrate exactly how our language and even our activism has been impacted by a need to play along with the concept of gender ideology in order to avoid abuse or hurting feelings. Truthfully, this is not a discussion about excluding a certain category of women from women's spaces, but about maintaining women's spaces from the intrusion of men. She notes how this mindset has impacted the definition of womanhood, which has in turn been deemed hateful, even though it is accurate and as benign as the definition for a car. Kelly J. Keene Minshall, better known as Posey Parker, erected a billboard with this definition, which a man named Adrian Harrop complained about, leading to its removal. During an interview, Posey Parker asked, "How is the definition of woman offensive? What a ludicrous thing to say." To which Adrian responded, "It isn't about the definition itself, though, is it, Posey? It's not about that. It's about the fact that you specifically and explicitly, you have explicitly excluded trans women from your definition of women. Would you like to explain to us what a woman is, Mr. Harrop?" "A woman is a person who identifies as a woman." Kara points out this definition is quite a shoddy one. To anyone who cares to dwell on it for more than a moment, it's easy to recognize that this is a circular definition and one which defines nothing by using the word meant to be defined within the definition. She writes, "First, if it is true that a woman can be any person who identifies as a woman, then solely on the basis of logic, it must also be true that any person can be any type of person that the person claims to identify as. For example, if it is true that a woman can be any person who identifies as a woman, then solely on the basis of logic, it must also be true that a child can be any person who identifies as a child. We know this cannot be the case." It is striking that we have to argue over definitions that are accurate and have never been in question, but Kara's way of breaking it down is a great way to illustrate to casual supporters or moderates the illogical rationale used to support the ideology. It shows the foundation of the movement as being built on sand. She points out the importance of understanding why specification and definitions matter, namely by noting the historical pattern in American law of the discrimination of women on the basis of their sex, and specifically notes in the case of Reed v. Reed, wherein a young man with no offspring had died in state without a will in the state of Idaho. Under Idaho law, the next of kin was the young man's parents, who had separated. Both parents wanted to serve as executor of the estate, but Idaho law had an explicit provision that in the event of a dispute, men were to be given a preference. So the father was made executor. The mother sued, and the Supreme Court eventually and rightfully determined that this was unfair. The point, for present purposes, is that the Idaho law explicitly discriminated against women on the basis of sex, as have many laws all over the world for thousands of years. I actually was aware of this case before, but I find the inclusion of specific and clear legal cases to be a great way to drive the point of women are real and so is discrimination against them as a sex class. Chapter 2 is titled The Legal Abolition of Sex. It focuses on how biological sex is being abolished in U.S. law by working through several legal cases. This is especially helpful because most people are unable to accurately parse legalese and have a hard time understanding both historical precedent and future implications. She starts with the Equality Act. The so-called Equality Act was initially introduced in the U.S. Congress in 2015. I refer to it as so-called because, if enacted, the law would eradicate the sex-based rights of women and girls. It has, as of this writing, not been enacted, though it passed in the House of Representatives in February 2021 and in the State Judiciary Committee in March. The bill is long and difficult to parse for lawyers and non-lawyers alike. Its stated purpose is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes. This is disingenuous, however, because what it would actually do is redefine sex to include gender identity throughout the U.S. civil rights law. The statutory redefinition would mean that any person could claim to be discriminated against on the basis of sex if the person believed that he or she had been discriminated against on the basis of so-called gender identity for virtually all purposes. She then goes on to explain how Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of sex, allows women to protest against mistreatment against them which occurred because of their sex. Gender identity being involved would make it difficult to maintain these protections in court, not in the least because gender identity, despite being enshrined in law, is never clearly defined. The Equality Act redefines sex through the inclusion of gender identity in law, which would force sex to be reinterpreted in a way that ignores sex. Places of public accommodations such as inns and motels, restaurants, and other places that serve food, gas stations, or places of entertainment, which, according to the Civil Rights Act, would prevent discrimination based on sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity. The best example of this in action is one you're probably familiar with: the Wii Spa Incident back in 2021, where a man entered the women's area where women and underage girls were nude with an erection. The spa refused to remove him as, under California law, it would be considered discrimination to not validate his gender identity. Many argued that this was a hoax, that the woman complaining was in the wrong, but it was later revealed that he had prior sex crime convictions. Quite simply, the Equality Act allows men to enter women's spaces and provides no opportunity for recourse or safety measures, as it defines gender identity as being of similar importance to sex, even though the two can be very contradictory. The next legal matter Kara represents is Biden's executive orders. Ever since coming into office, the Biden administration has been working to further enshrine gender identity into law. Thankfully, because they are administrative actions and not actual legislation, they will be easier to undo, although the Democratic Party seemingly has no desire to do so. As she writes, within hours of taking the oath of office, President Biden signed an executive order preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Executive Order 13988. The executive order established that it is the official policy of the Biden-Harris administration that sex is to be defined to include gender identity, i.e., that sex is to be interpreted by all federal agencies in a manner that ignores sex. The order directed all federal agencies to redefine sex to include gender identity throughout federal administrative law. So I think it's important to point out here that gender identity and sexuality are not related at all. Sexuality will be covered under a ruling against discrimination based on sex because the issue of sexuality is that homosexuality is considered not normative and being attracted to women is only punished if you're a woman, for example. The continual linking of sexuality of gender ideology means that most people will view them as being under the same umbrella, despite gender ideology being homophobic at its core, and presents disagreeing with one as an implicit opposition to the other, which is simply not the case. As this order is implemented, it means that the Department of Housing and Urban Development now defines sex as inclusive of gender identity. And since pretty much all housing in the U.S. is covered by the Fair Housing Act, there can effectively be no female-only housing. Similarly, the HHS now interprets the Affordable Care Act to define sex as gender identity, which prevents women from demanding female-only health providers. Title IX's protections for women and girls are also essentially moot by allowing gender identity to be protected as an adjacent definition to sex. The chapter concludes with an analysis of various court cases which illustrate the damage done to women's rights and the pushback towards any sort of questioning about gender identity or desire to protect women's spaces. I particularly like this chapter because it delves into the legal matters in a clear and concise way and simplifies a lot of information that not everyone has the background to easily understand. If you're interested in hearing more about legal examples of cultural insanity, I definitely recommend this chapter specifically, especially in the light of so much misinformation being passed around by the left. Chapter 3, titled Implications for Women and Girls of Abolishing Sex, points out how little forethought seems to have gone into this across-the-board acceptance of gender ideology as the progressive and right path to take. It touches on many topics that I have covered before, which aligned together adds up to a shocking amount of harm and stupidity. Crime, for example, is being reported on incorrectly. Reporters often neglect to mention that the women who commit crimes, such as Jacob Neves, who received 30 years for child sex abuse, are actually male. Many headlines are misleading like this, which would leave anyone who's merely skimming headlines under the belief that women are committing these crimes. At least some of these do clarify in the text that these are trans-identified men, but others obfuscate this information, making it difficult to determine the truth without a photo or a naturally suspicious mind. And of course, this doesn't even touch on the impact of recording crimes this way for FBI and other crime statistics. Quite simply, the abolition of sex is occurring not only in law, but in journalism as well. Medicine and health is another field which is heavily impacted by this new mindset. Sex impacts everything about your health, from the way that your body functions to the way that healthcare treatments work. If sex is treated as the same as gender identity, then even if one is male, they cannot be excluded from a study which is supposed to be sex-specific, which can drastically influence the results due to sex-based differences, putting consumers at risk. Prisons have been a big talking point as well, as by allowing gender identity to take precedence, men, even those with sexual or violent convictions, have been allowed to live in female prisons. In California, the state even implicitly supported the rape of incarcerated women by adding condom dispensers, even though all sex while incarcerated is considered rape. The invasion of sports and shelters is touched on as well. I was, however, quite surprised to find a section on woke homophobia, which touches on the Dana Rivers case, Mitchfest, the exclusion of lesbians from LGBTQ task forces, and highlights 3 major areas where lesbians and bisexual women are affected by gender ideology. 1. Pressure to have unwanted sex with men who claim to be women. 2. Pressure to transition due to being gender nonconforming. 3. A loss of access to female-only spaces to have community. All of these are points that many who are not aware of what gender ideology means would likely change their mind about now that they know. It's really evident here that Kara knows how to write for her audience. Not only does she take the time to really explain the consequences and the logic of gender ideology without using their language, but she provides enough information and personal anecdotes to keep someone well-versed on the topic engaged. Chapter 4 continues this with the abolition of sex in media and discourse. She starts this chapter off with an acknowledgement that many people will be surprised by. Everything that she has previously written about is considered bigoted and not allowed. Not only is it a faux pas to discuss this, but language itself is being changed to make discussion even more difficult. Mainstream media is biased towards trans people, which can be seen through their language choices. Trans athletes is commonly used instead of men and boys, which would be more accurate. Healthcare actually refers to puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries with a myriad of side effects, which remains unnoted. Opposition to this is painted as uniformly conservative instead of reflecting feminist critiques on the topic. Only conservative-leaning news outlets seem willing to discuss these topics critically, or to even give coverage to feminist or left-leaning groups which oppose gender ideology. This serves to further aid the idea that all opposition is conservative and illustrates an obvious media bias. Social media is no different, and as can be seen on Twitter and Reddit. Cancellation and deplatforming are common, and the law itself has been used to silence women under the guise of criticism being hate speech. She finishes the chapter with a critique of preferred pronouns, which are a form of social conformity, and which plays into many of the previous points she discussed. Chapter 5. The gender identity industry asks a very important question. Why? I think this is answered perfectly in the following passage. An invisible industry exists that is driving this entire apparatus, and although it operates openly, few people seem to know about it. Its primary objective is simple, but breathtakingly audacious: to obliterate human life as we know it. The philosophical starting point for this radical campaign is the denial of nature and the limits it places on our ability to reimagine ourselves and the world. Only by dethroning the idea of objective reality and asserting that primacy of subjectivity, i.e., lived experience, can we create a new reality of godlike freedom in which we all have the ability to remake ourselves in their own projected image. Women's rights and interests, to the extent that they depend on our biological existence as women, are obstacles in the way of this agenda. Obliterating biological sex in the law and throughout society is thus the starting point. Women's rights and bodies are collateral damage. Although it sounds like a conspiracy theory, as something too far-fetched to be true, Kara pins down the crux of the issue, one that I believe is heavily tied to the way the internet has changed how we view the self and create our own identities. Kara even acknowledges that it is tempting to dismiss all of this as a fringe conspiracy, but this does not negate the truth. There is no secret cabal or group running this, but rather that there is generally a tacit agreement among some of the most powerful entities in our society to persuade everyone that sex does not exist as a material reality and that subjective reality reigns supreme. This is linked to postmodernism and queer theory, headed by Michael Foucault, which presents sex as something which can be opted in or out of. In turn, this presents female oppression as not benefiting men and as coming to be simply because. The inclusion of the word transgender in our daily language has helped this claim because the word itself is ill-defined. All that is needed to be transgender is to declare it. Much like the gender's definition of women, it is a nonsensical in its inclusivity. However, the phrase is great for selling products such as medical procedures and treatments that are expensive or lifelong, or just trans flag patterned pin shirts and other knickknacks. The definition of women via hypersexuality and femininity, which many trans-identified men have sexual responses for, is just another blow to the women's liberation movement and our general dignity. In conclusion, I really enjoyed the book. It was short and to the point and something that I would recommend to moderates or conservatives who are on the fence or want to know more about this topic. The blunt language may be a turnoff for liberals who are highly supportive of trans topics, which they may refuse to engage with anyhow. But I still think it's a great guide for arguing or discussing this with someone else. Just like Helen Joyce's Trans, this book has plenty of great arguments which are easy to understand. I wish that it touched on the female side of things, but I understand why she didn't. Trans-identified women, or trans men, and non-binary women tend to have their issues centered in the impact of the industry. They are typically victims. They have health detriments because of surgeries and hormone usage, as well as the mental health issues which lead to trans-identification. But there are other books on that topic, and I understand that Kara's focus was on the harm to women. I also feel that the passages which noted that everyone or men are harmed as well are a bit similar to the plea that feminism can help men too. Although, again, I understand needing to structure this a certain way for a larger audience. Overall, if you have a few hours to sit down and read it, if you want something to be a primer for debates, if you're someone who's, needs some arguments to reference, this is a good book for it. Especially for anyone who's interested in the legal side of things, because that's one side that I don't think we hear discussed nearly as much as we should. This, dear viewers, is where we part. Let me know in the comment section down below if you have any comments, questions, or concerns. What do you think about this review? What do you think about this book? And I will talk to you guys next time.